So, Jai Shrimanan, everyone. Thank you so much for joining again. Happy Independence Day. And just a recap of what we went over last time. Last time we looked at the Cholan Empire, which grew over the 900s, 1000 CE era. And then also following that, we had the Delhi Sultanates, the Ghaznavids and the Ghurids that came before the Delhi Sultanate. And we had the Mamluk dynasty, the Khilji dynasty, and eventually we ended up with the Lodi dynasty. And the Lodi dynasty is the last dynasty of the Delhi Sultanate, and we'll be looking at their story and how their story eventually leads to the Mughal Empire. And we also looked at the Vijayanagara Empire in the south, heralded by one of the greatest kings of all of India, Krishna Devaraya. He was undefeated in battle, an excellent administrator, and we looked through his story as well. So now we're looking at after the many dynasties of the Delhi Sultanate really became small in size after the rise of the Vijayanagara Empire, after the rise of Mewar and a lot of Hindu kingdoms which rose up and took control back from the Delhi Sultanate. So now the Delhi Sultanate has become really tiny. It's become smaller, not tiny, it's become smaller. It's headed by the Lodi dynasty now, by Ibrahim Lodi. And then this will eventually set up the advent of the Mughal Empire into India, which went on for quite a long time, 1526 to 1857. This is the entirety in which the Mughal Empire lasted, although the height of their power was only for a smaller period of time. Because following the rise of the Marathas, the Mughals were still there, but they were subservient to the Marathas. So the story of the Mughal Empire starts with Babur. So Babur ruled only for 4 years, but he was from modern day Uzbekistan. So he was one of the many Turkic invaders that came to India. And he claimed a very impressive lineage. He claimed that he had Timur on his father's side, Taimur on his father's side, and Genghis Khan on his mother's side. So you can see how he, to politically advance himself, that's the lineage he had that would help him. Now, Taimur, we didn't mention, in this period of Turkic invasions, Taimur was also a Turkic invader that came to India in order to plunder India. He was a plunderer like most Turkic invaders. He came, he looted a bunch of riches and he left. He was very brutal, he was a very cruel person. And then Genghis Khan, obviously we know, he also was a very cruel, very bloodthirsty type of expansionist. So first, Babur came from Uzbekistan and he consolidated Kabul in present-day Afghanistan. And after consolidating Kabul, he then made his move into entering India. So the political atmosphere of the time was the two main powers in the north were the Lodi dynasty of the Delhi Sultanate by Ibrahim Lodi and the Rajput Confederacy. So in Rajputana, there are many, many Rajput states, Mewar, Marwar, Bundi, a lot of Rajput states, independent kingdoms. But every once in a while, a great king would rise up and try to unite them. Mostly that was the king that would usually be from Mewar. Mewar was the most prominent of the Rajput states, Mewar and Marwar. So we'll see those two kingdoms also come up as we go along our story today. So Rana Sanga united the Rajput Confederacy and into a loosely connected confederacy between the Rajput states. So they were a huge threat to Babur's planned invasion in India. Babur wanted to retake a lot of territories that he felt that he was obligated to because his ancestors held it at some time. And this is a portrait of Babur right here. So you can see how, although in our modern pop culture and cinema, we show the Mughal emperors as if they were Indians, as if they were people that looked like us in a way. But you can see the Turkic invaders, they were from entirely different countries. They were foreign invaders just like the British were. So the advent of the Mughal Empire would be decided by the first Battle of Panipat. So the first Battle of Panipat was between the Delhi Sultanate, and over here would be Babur, who would eventually establish the Mughal Empire in India. So the Mughal is a term that comes from the word Mongol, because Babur claimed as from. Sorry?
I have a question. Can you go back to the other paper?
Yeah.
How come they made a portrait of him?
Some of the portraits are based off of old portraits. Some portraits have survived, and some of them are modern recreations of older portraits.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, so going back to the first Battle of Panipat, so Babur basically wanted to rule Punjab because at one point Taimur had Punjab, but then he eventually left after looting and raiding the place. Punjab always took the blunt of these invasions because they were situated right in the way of any Western invasions. So Babur first marched to Lahore, and the Lodi army that held Lahore was completely routed, and they were forced back to Panipat. So a lot of the people there supported the Delhi Sultanate. So what Babur did was he killed and he terrorized a lot of innocent people, a lot of civilians like you and me that were just living, not military people, ordinary people of Lahore. And after terrorizing and killing these people, Babur then positioned his army and moved into Panipat, where the Lodi dynasty would make their final stand, and it would mark the end of the Delhi Sultanate. So you can see during this time, you still have the Vijayanagar Empire that's powerful in the south, and the Deccan Sultanates, the Gujarat Sultanate, and the Rajput state. So Mewar is the primary state, we can see as per its size and its prominence, and this entirety would be the Rajput states, which here just says Rajput states because there are many small states. So it's hard to show all of them on this map. So the first Battle of Panipat happened in 1526 with Babur on the Mughal side and Ibrahim Lodi, which was the ruler of the Delhi Sultanate of the Lodi dynasty. So we can see how the Lodi dynasty had the upper hand in terms of numbers, because the Mughals only had 12 to 25,000 soldiers, and the Lodi dynasty had 40,000 cavalry, 30,000 infantry, and 400 elephants, a typical Indian army of the time. But the one advantage the Mughals had were these 15 to 20 field guns, which they utilized very smartly in order to turn the tides and win this war. So this is a picture of the first Battle of Panipat. So when these two enemies, these two rivals met, what Babur did was he set up his right flank right across Panipat. So that's why this is called the first Battle of Panipat due to the geography of where the battle took place. And what Babur did was, this was a strategy that he would use again in the future. He would take these massive carts that could hold lots and lots of men. And on these carts, the men would basically, either the muskets would shoot, the archers would shoot, and they would use these as a sort of moving fortress. So that was one of his main strategies. And they would all be connected by this iron link. And between this iron link, you would have these cannons, which would be situated like this, so that the cannons could also shoot at the enemy, as could both the archers and the muskets. So it was a completely revolutionized, very intelligent way of fighting to attack the enemy as much as possible with all your firearms and all your archers and all that. And you can see how he set up behind with his cavalry, and he built a little fortification here so that Lodi's army cannot go around and attack from the side. And Panipat is blocking off the other side. And you can see how Ibrahim Lodi has a very traditional army. He has a bunch of spears, cavalry, elephants that he put in the front. And this one move would mark the end of the entire Delhi Sultanate. This one move of keeping his elephants and what Lodi will do next. So Babur defeats and annexes the entire Delhi Sultanate. So instead of just getting land, he completely took the Delhi Sultanate. The reason was because of the fact that he had firearms that he got from the Ottomans and the Safavids that he used against Lodi. So what Babur's guns did was, Lodi's elephants were not used to these guns. They were not used to the sound of guns. They were not used to the sound of gunpowder firearms. So when when the cannons would shoot and when the muskets would shoot, the sound frightened Lodi's elephants so much that they eventually turned around, and when in their efforts to run away, they trampled over Lodi's own army. So that caused massive casualties to Ibrahim Lodi. And in this battle, Ibrahim Lodi tries to turn the tide of the battle, but in his efforts, he dies in battle. And now the Sultan himself has died, the entire army fell apart, and it was easy for the Mughals to come in and establish the Mughal Empire in India. And this marked the complete end of the Delhi Sultanate, from Jalaluddin to Alauddin from the Mamluks to the Turks, and eventually now we have from the Sayyids now to the Lodis. Eventually, this has marked the end of the Delhi Sultanate and the rise of the Mughal Empire, and it marks a new era in Indian history. So as we mentioned, we had two important powers in the north, the Lodi dynasty and the Rajput Confederacy. Now the Lodi dynasty has been taken out of the picture, but Rana Sanga of Mewar, so Mewar is an important Rajput kingdom. It will come up a lot as we talk further and further. Rana Sanga was the king of Mewar. So he ruled for 20 years from 1508 to 1528. And he has said to have fought over 100 battles in which he lost his arm, he lost his right arm, and he lost his eye. But yet he fought over and over in war. So that just shows the incredible tenacity and strength of this man. He's missing an arm and he's missing an eye, but yet he fought alongside his soldiers in war all the time. So after his father died, there was a war of succession between Rana Sanga and his brothers, in which Rana Sanga won and became the king of Mewar. And what Rana Sanga did was that was very important and very crucial was that he united all the clans of Rajputana into a confederacy, which had not happened for 300 years. It happened before, earlier on in the Turkic invasion era, but after that, the Rajputs had broken apart. So he united the clans of Rajputana. And he united the Rajput chiefs, regardless of their religion, of their certain beliefs, and he created a Rajput identity in which everyone could feel a part of and be proud of. And he was regularly fighting the Turkic invaders as well. So now the Battle of Kanwa is when Rana Sanga initially he thought Babur was just another plunderer, like the Ghaznavids, like the Ghurids, like Timur. He thought Babur was just another plunderer that would come try to take India's wealth and leave. So he was trying to approach the situation as diplomatically and as strategically as he possibly thought he could do. But what Rana Sanga realized is that Babur is not here just to plunder. The Mughals were not here just to take wealth and leave. The Mughals wanted to set up in India because of India's wealth, and they wanted to rule over the Indian people. So Rana Sanga attacked the Mughal guard on 1527, and he completely annihilated the Mughal guard, and he also defeated the Mughal reinforcements that Babur then sent. When Babur heard that Rana Sanga wiped out the Mughal guard, he sent more and more reinforcements, but Rana Sanga defeated those as well. And this would eventually lead to a full blown out war. This incredible victory of Rana Sanga would mark the beginning of Rajput Mughal tensions. So then Rana Sanga went on to consolidate the coalition of the Rajput chiefs, and he created a unified Rajput movement against the invading imperial Mughal Empire. So for the Battle of Kanwa, Babur used a similar strategy that he did with the Lodi Empire, with the fastened carts, with the cannons in between and the men on top of the carts, and he standing behind with his army behind this fortification. It was a long and bloody battle, and what turned the tide of the battle was Siladi of Raisan, which was a Rajput chief, an important Rajput chief. During the war, he betrayed the Rajputs. And he quickly joined up with the Mughals. So this was a huge blow to Rana Sanga, because it caused Rana Sanga to have to abruptly change his plans, because all the plans they had were now pretty much useless, because now an entire chunk of the army has defected over to the other side. So Siladi of Raisan basically defected over to the Mughals during the war as well, to make matters worse. So in this chaos of what happened because of this, Rana Sanga was shot. He was shot and he was unconscious for a while. But by the time he regained consciousness, the war was lost. It was going against the Rajputs because of all these situations and all these factors that happened. And this led to a Rajput defeat. And this defeat led to a collapse of the Rajput Confederacy. So how the confederacy that Rana Sanga built with all the Rajputs united together basically fell apart. The Rajputs were no longer a united force. But the Mughals did not come in and they didn't invade Rajputana. They didn't take Rajputana lands. They didn't take the entirety of Rajputana. The main loss in this is that the Rajputs were no longer unified. And this one war, which caused the Rajputs to break apart, would affect Rajput resistance against the Mughal Empire as we go on and on. And eventually, a year after this war, Rana Sanga would die in Chittor. It's believed that the reason he died in Chittor was that he was poisoned, and he was poisoned by his own chiefs. Because what Rana Sanga wanted to do was he wanted to launch another attack on the Mughal Empire. Because this one had fallen apart because of many factors, such as Siladi betraying the Rajputs. But it's believed the chiefs did not think that invading the Mughal Empire was the right move. So they poisoned and killed him. And Babur had this practice that was inherited by Taimur as well, which he claimed ancestry from. And his practice was that he would build a tower of skulls. So he would find the bodies of his defeated enemies and he would take their skulls and he would basically build pyramid like towers of the skulls in order to make people think twice before picking a fight with him and in trying to intimidate the people. So that's the type of brutal, cruel practices that Babur had in his invasions. So this was the initial Mughal expansion brought upon. So this is following the end of the Delhi Sultanate and how they expanded. They expanded up towards Kashmir and they expanded all the way to Bengal. And you can see how the Rajput states and Mewar are still independent, although they've been weakened by this series of Mughal expansions. So you can see in 3 years, Babur expanded his empire a lot. But eventually Babur died and in 1530 Humayun took over. So this was the start of the empire. This was the empire that Humayun inherited. And this is another portrait of Humayun. The thing about Humayun is that he was very inexperienced. He was not as experienced as a king of such a large empire should be. And he had conflicts with Sher Shah Suri, which was a ruler that wanted to take advantage of Humayun's inexperience. And during this 10 years of Humayun's rule, Sher Shah Suri won many Mughal territories. He came, he would raid, and he eats up the Mughal territories, and Humayun was not able to do much against him. One thing that Humayun did was he defeated the Sultan of Gujarat. So we go back here. The Sultan of Gujarat, so it allowed him to expand more towards the Gujarat. Gujarat is a very important place in especially medieval Indian politics because Gujarat allows for trade with the Arab world. Gujarat had a lot of ports. The coast was excellent for trading with the Arab world, trading with the Ottomans, the Safavids, and it was very good to owning Gujarat allowed for a lot of money to be pulled in with trade. So that's why a lot of Mughals would eye Gujarat very often. You will see Akbar in the future also will eye Gujarat. So after defeating the Sultan of Gujarat, the Sultan actually planned to attack Humayun with Portuguese aid. So by now, the colonial power that entered India was the Portuguese. Although they were very small, they were only contained to Goa. And Humayun defeated them. And Humayun also had to deal with many revolts from his brothers. So after Babur passed on his title to Humayun, Humayun had to deal with a lot of revolts from his brothers. His brothers were also eyeing the throne. And it was said that Humayun, whenever his brothers would revolt, all his courtiers and the people in his court would say that since he's revolted, you have to execute him and make an example of this to the people so that people don't think of revolting against you again. But Humayun claimed that Babur's last words to him was, even if your brothers deserve it, don't do any harm to them. So regardless of all these revolts that his brothers were doing, Humayun took a very lenient policy against them. So as we talked about Sher Shah Suri, he was pushing more and more into the Mughal Empire, to this fledgling empire. And eventually it led to Humayun having to withdraw from India completely because of Sher Shah Suri. And he had to take refuge in Persia. So Sher Shah Suri came and actually took power in India for a short period of time. And then when Humayun went to Persia, the Persian king wanted Humayun to convert from Sunni Islam to Shia Islam. Eventually, Humayun's ancestors would convert back to Sunni Islam, but Humayun agreed because Humayun was not in a position to make demands, and the Persian king was the only king that was giving him any proper refuge. And without the refuge of the Persian king, Humayun would be easily killed by Sher Shah Suri. So he used this Persian support that he got from the Persian king to retake India and push the Surs out. But the Surs reconquered Delhi again after his death. So because of Humayun's experience, the Mughal Empire suffered a lot in these early stages of it. You can see Humayun's conflicts. Upon the expansion of the Mughal Empire, due to Sher Shah Suri's invasions, he lost most of the Mughal Empire. And you can see how the Mughals lost and just became this tiny place, while Sher Shah Suri managed to take this entirety of India. But only for a short period of time, because within a couple of years, eventually the Mughals would take their territory back, and the Surs were once again small, and the Surs and the Mughals had this little on and off conflict. And we can see throughout this entire thing, the Vijayanagara Empire is happening in the south. So a lot of these events, a lot of these empires are happening parallelly at the same time. So now we have the legendary Akbar, which we all remember. Um, that's remembered mostly in in history books and textbooks, and he is remembered as the greatest Mughal emperor for mainly one reason, which is because he had a very unusual policy of tolerance, which was not found by these Turkic invaders. The Turkic invaders always had a policy of feeling that Islam should dominate the Hindu people, and Islam should convert all the Hindus should convert to Islam, and they believed the Hindus were all kafirs, and they had this religious notion of superiority. It's safe to say also Akbar shared some of those notions because we cannot say he was completely detached from the norms of the time, but Akbar was tolerant towards the other subjects of his kingdom, which is why the Mughal Empire during Akbar was was during some of the more prosperous ages, because Akbar didn't have to deal with the Hindus and the other people of India always making war with him, because a good amount of the Hindus were somewhat pleased under Akbar, because for the first part he abolished the religious taxes on non-Muslims. So this was something that was there since Alauddin Khilji's times for hundreds of years, which basically put overwhelming taxes on Hindus in order to get them to convert to Islam or to keep the Hindus poor so they don't have the means to revolt against the Mughals. So this was one thing that Akbar removed, and it led many Hindus to be more accepting of this foreign person sitting on their heads. One thing though, Akbar was born in the borders of India. Today, I think he was born in present-day Pakistan. But people tend to view Akbar as more of an indigenous kind. They tend to view Akbar as more Indian than the other Turkic invaders. Not because he was a pure Indian, but firstly because he was born in India. Back then, he was born in a place in Rajputana. And he abolished the religious taxes on non-Muslims. And in his court, he would always have discussions with members of all religions, whether it was Islam, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism. He would have conversations when people of all religions would come and talk with him. In fact, Akbar even created his own religion for a while, which eventually didn't get far. But he was a very different kind of person, not a typical Mughal emperor. And during his rule, the Mughal Empire tripled in size. So he's also very capable military general. So Akbar's initial consolidation, the Surs at this point were defeated, and Akbar spread his empire southwards. And we can see Mewar, Rajputs they're still around. At this point, the Vijayanagara Empire had fallen apart due to many internal issues and invasions by the Bijapur Sultanate and issues with the Deccan Sultanates. So then Mysore became the more powerful territory of the south, and you have the Ahmednagar Bijapur Sultanate, which will become very important as the Mughal Empire expands and they come nearby to these territories. So the Second Battle of Panipat in 1556, Hemu was a Hindu ruler that was underneath the Surs, and Akbar defeated the Surs with the help of Bairam Khan, which was his mentor. Eventually, after a while, Akbar wanted to rule on his own. Akbar took power when he was really young because Humayun died pretty early, and Akbar was forced to take power really young. And Bairam Khan, who was his regent that basically ruled for Akbar and helped Akbar retain his power because he was so young. Bairam Khan helped Akbar defeat Hemu and the Surs and establish the Mughal Empire, and the Surs were completely annihilated. Eventually, though, as Akbar grew, Akbar didn't like the fact that Bairam Khan was doing work for him, and Akbar wanted to become the king of the Mughal Empire. He didn't like that Bairam Khan was ruling for him. So Akbar had Bairam Khan removed from his post and ordered Bairam Khan to take the Hajj to Makkah. So on the way to the Hajj in Makkah, Bairam Khan is said to have revolted against Akbar, and Akbar rode out against his former mentor and had him defeated and sent Bairam Khan packing back to Makkah. And Akbar waged a lot of wars and he established his rule in northern India. And one thing Akbar made clear that was different than the last Turkic invaders is that he didn't want the Mughals to just loot India as well. He wanted to rule over India. So that's why you see during the Mughal Empire rule, if we see India's share of the world GDP, while it fluctuates a bit and it goes down, India does not lose as much the share of the world economy as it did in the British time. In the British time, India went from having over a quarter, 25%, over 25% of the entire world economy to having just 4% when the British were done with us. The British completely impoverished us, took all our wealth and sent it back to Britain. What the Mughals did differently was they ruled over us, they took our wealth, but technically India was still wealthy in terms of, in a very broad sense. You could still say India's share of the world economy did not go down because of the Mughal invasions. The reason was because was a lot of wealth went from the common people and it went up to fill Mughal coffers and it went up to the Muslim elite. So technically all the wealth is still in India only. But the people are getting more impoverished because the per capita GDP is per person wealth, the amount of money a person has. The growth during the Mughal Empire per person wealth was very low. People were not getting rich. The empire was getting rich. That's an important distinction. A lot of people use that as a way to justify Mughal invasion, saying, see, it wasn't like the British. The British completely impoverished us. The Mughals didn't impoverish us. Look at our world share of the world economy. That's because the Mughals took wealth from the common people of India and used it to consolidate their own rule. So this is what Akbar did. He made clear that the Mughals were to rule over all of India. He did not just want to invade it, plunder the riches, and run off. And he continued his imperial expansions, and he had a lot of conflicts, particularly in the early stages with Rajputana. Now, what you have to understand about the Rajputs is the Rajputs are a very legendary type of people in Indian history. They have a very strict honor code, a very strict moral system, and a strict sense of principles and values that they would rather die 1,000 deaths than forego on those values and principles. They were very honorable and dignified type of people, and they were a warrior class. So they were like an example or a analogy would be like the knights of Europe. In Europe, the knights had this code of chivalry. In Japan, the samurai had a code of bushido. Like that, the Rajputs had their own code of values that they were vehemently insistent upon following out. And they were like the Spartans. The Spartans were a very warrior class of people. In Greek, they were kind of like the Spartans in terms of being very much oriented towards war and a warrior type of way, because they were Kshatriyas. So as the Mughals began dominating India, there was a lot of resistance to Mughal imperialism, which we will talk about. So the first character we have to talk about in our history, especially with the Mughal invasions into Rajputana. So that's what we're focusing on right now, the Mughal invasions into Rajputana. Was Uday Singh II. He ruled over Mewar. So the way Uday Singh became king was also a very tough battle. So Uday Singh's brother Banvir seized the throne, and after he seized the throne forcibly, he aimed to kill Uday Singh when Uday Singh was very young. Because just having Uday Singh alive means if Uday Singh grows up, then he has the potential to come back and take the throne. So Banvir wasn't taking any chances. He wanted to kill his brother in order to solidify his hold on the throne. And I wanted to mention this because it shows how many sacrifices, especially on Independence Day, we can reflect on how many sacrifices that happened that we are not aware of, and how many sacrifices that have happened that have been forgotten or have been lost to history and time. So Uday Singh's nurse Panadai also had a child called Chandan, who was the same age, same size as Uday Singh. So what happened basically was when Manbir came found Uday Singh in his room after Uday Singh fled, he found Uday Singh and he wanted to kill Uday Singh. What Uday Singh's nurse Panadai did was, she swapped Uday Singh, who was technically the prince, the heir to Mewar, she swapped Uday Singh with her own son Chandan. So Banbir came, he killed Chandan in front of Panadai's eyes. He killed Chandan and he left. So Panadai gave up her own son. She sacrificed her own son willingly in order to save Uday Singh, because she knew that Uday Singh needed to eventually grow up and take back Mewar. And Uday Singh was a capable ruler that she wanted to be able to take Mewar. So she had that type of foresight that in an instant she gave up her own son in order to keep her country, in order to keep her nation safe. So a lot of sacrifices like this. We don't, not just warriors or kings that ruled and went into battle, even ordinary people sacrificed a lot for us to be celebrating India's independence today. And Uday Singh's son, Maharana Pratap, would be born in 1540, which was the same year Uday Singh became king, who he went to war against Banbir and he seized back Mewar. And eventually, as the Mughal Empire was expanding, there were immediate conflicts with the Mughals because the Mughals firstly wanted Gujarat. So if you see, if this is India and you have the Mughals coming down here, if this is Rajputana, you have Gujarat here. In order to access Gujarat, the Mughals need to go through Rajputana. They could go around. Technically, geographically, they can go around. But the Mughals knew the Rajputs were such a proud, powerful, honorable type of people that their empire could not be safe if the Rajputs were independent and free. So those are two main reasons that Akbar wanted the Rajputs to bow down to him. So unfortunately, during this time, most Rajput chiefs and kingdoms, despite their honor, despite their dignity, despite their values, put that aside, put their values and principles aside, and they bowed down to Mughal strength, Mughal dominance. So Mughals had a lot of influence over Rajputana. The two main empires, Mewar and Marwar, not empires, the two main Rajput kingdoms, Mewar and Marwar, which Mewar was ruled by Uday Singh, the person we're talking about right now. Marwar was by Chandrasen Rathore. They both refused to bow down to Mughal power because they were still proud Rajputs. They still held on to the Rajput values and the Rajput code. So Akbar needed to defeat Uday Singh because Uday Singh was the head of the Sisodia clan. The Sisodia clan was a very well reputed, very dignified, very honorable, respected clan, especially in Rajputana. Now, if you can defeat the head of the Sisodia clan, that would give you power over a majority of Rajputana there itself. And Akbar also wanted to show Islam as superior to Hinduism. And defeating the Rajputs were these incredible, fabled heroes, incredible and fabled warriors, as like champions, as these Hindu champions, as Hindu warriors. Defeating them would be a great way to show Islam as superior to Hinduism. So that was one reason why Akbar wanted also to force the Rajputs to bow down to Mughal power, particularly Mewar and Marwar. So this led to the eventual siege of Chittorgarh. So the Mughals and Mewar had a lot of little battles back and forth, back and forth. But the main battle was the siege of Chittorgarh. So Akbar sent an envoy to Uday Singh, telling Uday Singh that if you give up, if you bow down and become a tributary and rule underneath the Mughal flag, then we'll let you live, we'll let your people live, and you can continue doing your work. Uday Singh refused. And his exact words, that was written by a Persian writer with Akbar, said Uday Singh refused to submit as none of his ancestors had bowed down and kissed the ground. So Uday Singh was still a proud Rajput and he refused to bow down to this foreign entity. And another reason that Akbar that he ruined the ties between Mewar and the Mughals even more was Baz Bahadur of Malwa and the Mirzas of Sambal, which were two kingdoms that the Mughals had defeated. The leaders of these two kingdoms came and took refuge, asked for asylum with Uday Singh, and Uday Singh granted them asylum, granted them refuge. And Akbar demanded Uday Singh release them and be sent back to the Mughals. Uday Singh refused because Uday Singh said that as they had come and taken my asylum, I cannot just give them back to you because that ruins my honor. It makes me seem like a dishonorable person who accepts someone and then throws them out. So this was another factor that caused war to become an inevitable eventuality. So the Mughals came around Chittorgarh. Chittorgarh was a massive, huge fort. So the Mughal force had to swell. They swelled to many thousands, tens and thousands. Historically, I think most historians of that time placed the Mughal force having about 80,000 men. 80,000 men, they had cannons, they came fully prepared. Chittor only had 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers within its walls. So as the siege continued, Uday Singh and the royal family was forced to escape and leave Chittor because the Mughal force was too large. And eventually, Chittor and the Mughals would have a war, and Chittor's walls were breached, and there was a huge war in which Akbar lost a lot of casualties. So the thing about the Rajputs is they had a practice in which if they were in a war or a situation where they were going to lose, there's no way for them to win. They would come out to war and they would fight and their intention would be to kill as many of the enemy as possible before they themselves die. So this was a very costly war for Akbar. Similarly, hundreds of years ago, when Alauddin Khilji invaded Chittorgarh, as legend says, for Padmavat, there also he lost a lot of men, and that's why when he came back, he was barely able to defend against the Mongol invasions because of the sheer size of casualties he took in order to take Chittorgarh. So Akbar lost a lot of men, and what Akbar's soldiers did was Akbar not only went inside and killed the enemy soldiers after the remaining soldiers in Chittorgarh were defeated, Akbar also killed 30,000 Mewari civilians as well, ordinary people living in houses. He had 30,000 innocent people that were living in the fort killed. So it shows that the way we sometimes view Akbar as some sort of peaceful, benevolent king, as you see these movies like Jodha Akbar, that try to show Akbar as some sort of egalitarian, incredible ruler that we should all aspire to, that view is a bit skewed. He might be better in terms of many aspects to his fellow Turkic invaders, but this one instance of many shows that Akbar was also he followed that brutal way of ruling and invading that his predecessors also had. Because this is shown when he had 30,000 civilians killed. And Uday Singh retreated and had a new capital built. Chittorgarh was the capital. They had a new capital built, which was eventually called Udaipur. Following Uday Singh's death, Jagmal, which was the younger brother of Maharana Pratap, tried to seize the throne of Mewar. He tried to seize the throne of Mewar, and the nobles of Mewar, the chiefs and nobles of Mewar, removed Jagmal and they put Maharana Pratap instead because they knew Pratap was more capable and Pratap was the older child. And they knew Pratap was a far more capable ruler than Jagmal would ever be. And this was a right move because immediately after they threw Jagmal out of Mewar, after Jagmal tried to seize Mewar, Jagmal ran off to Akbar and joined hands with Akbar. So it would have been a disaster had the nobles allowed Jagmal to take over the throne of Mewar. So Maharana Pratap is a larger than life figure, quite literally. His size was, he was 7 feet 5 inches tall, and he weighed well over 300 pounds, I believe. And this spear he had was around 80 pounds. So in terms of strength and his personality, he was an incredibly inspirational ruler, incredibly motivational general. And just by looking at him, a lot of soldiers would be roused to go and fight into battle. So he was a very apt, very good administrator, very good king. And obviously the kingdom that he inherited was in a very tumultuous political atmosphere. Mewar was still reeling from the loss from the siege of Chittorgarh, and Maharana Pratap now had to find a way in order to not only keep Mewar alive, but restore the territories that they lost. So Akbar sent many, many envoys asking Pratap to become a vassal, just like the other Rajputs. So if you know, this entire territory was the Rajput chieftains, the Rajput clans, and the Rajput kingdoms. A lot of them had bowed down to the Mughal Empire. This was Mewar. Mewar was also a bit bigger, but they lost a good amount of their eastern territories. They lost their eastern territories due to Akbar's invasions. But Maharana Pratap refused every time. Akbar sent envoy after envoy after envoy. Akbar didn't want to fight Pratap. He wanted to find a easy solution for him to establish dominance over Maharana Pratap without having to wage war. Maharana Pratap refused to bow down to Akbar, and Akbar was forced to attack Pratap because he wanted access to Gujarat and he needed the submission of the Rajputs in order to do so. So if we go into the kingdom that Maharana Pratap has inherited from Uday Singh, there's a loss of the eastern territories of Mewar, which is a very fertile, very important territory that produced a lot of crops, a lot of certain things for Mewar to function. So it was a huge loss. But Maharana Pratap still held a good amount of Mewar. They only lost Chittor and the eastern territories. And when Akbar invaded, there were a lot of many battles, which historians typically say that Pratap managed to repel the Mughal invaders many times. And then the main invasion was the Battle of Haldighat. Haldighat is a small narrow pass in which, like a small narrow pass which of mountain ranges, and you had Maharana Pratap's forces, and you had Akbar's forces across the other side. So Mewari sources say that there were 20,000 Mewari soldiers, and there were 80,000 Mughal soldiers. Persian sources say that Mewar had 3,400 total soldiers, and the Mughals had 10,000 soldiers. The only thing that both sources agree on, they might have different opinions when it comes to how many soldiers each side had. The only thing we know for sure was that the Mughal Empire had an army that was 4 times larger than Maharana Pratap's army. So the Mughal Empire outnumbered Maharana Pratap. So the Battle of Haldighat is sometimes portrayed as a sort of struggle between uh, a Hindu ruler and a Muslim ruler. And you can definitely make the argument for that. But the one thing is, Maharana Pratap had Muslim generals and Muslim soldiers in his army, and Akbar had Hindu Rajput generals and soldiers that fought for him because the Rajputs had uh, subjugated themselves to Mughal rule. So you see, the Mughals will use Rajput manpower a lot in their invasions because of the incredible warriors that the Rajputs were. So the general of Maharana Pratap's army was Hakim Khan Sur, who was an Afghan actually. He was an Afghan general. And Akbar's general was Man Singh of Jaipur, I believe. He was a Rajput king that became Akbar's right-hand man, Akbar's general. So Maharana Pratap realized that since he was outnumbered, he went for a full-on assault in order to beat the Mughals down with a superior Rajput bravery, superior Rajput bravado. Initially, this worked really well, but since they're outnumbered, since they were clashing head-on, the Mughals had the opportunity, since they were both clashing head-on, the Mughals had the opportunity to try to flank Maharana Pratap's army. But the Rajputs held on really well because just seeing Pratap going into war was apparently a feat to be watched. One incredible moment that is noted in the history of Haldighat, which is probably unprecedented in the world, I'm assuming, because this was when Maharana Pratap fought Belal Khan, who was a general of the Mughal army. And when he fought him, Belal Khan had just killed a general of Maharana Pratap, a general that Maharana Pratap was a good friend with. So in his anger, Maharana Pratap attacked Belal Khan, took his sword and sliced Belal Khan in half. Not only did he slice Belal Khan completely in half, this is as if something from a cartoon, but imagine it happening in real life, to the skull, the spine. He completely sliced Belal Khan in half, and the intensity in which he sliced his sword, it sliced through the horse of Belal Khan as well. Belal Khan had on armor, his horse had on armor. But imagine the strength of a person in order to cut someone in half like that. So this is another example of Maharana Pratap's strength and fortitude. So this obviously, it's noted here with Mewari soldiers, you can't see, but Mewari soldiers cheering Maharana Pratap on, and Mughal soldiers terrified of what they've just witnessed. So the Rajput bravery, the Rajput bravado and courage was really important in the Battle of Haldighat. So this is a very controversial issue, as in who won the Battle of Haldighat. Because Maharana Pratap had to eventually retreat into the forest regions due to the size of the Mughals, and the Mughals refused to pursue Maharana Pratap because Maharana Pratap knew the terrain far better than the Mughals did. So had the Mughals decided to come into the forest, Maharana Pratap would have finished them easily. So the Mughals also retreated afterwards. So this is used as an example by some historians to say that the Mughals won because Maharana Pratap had to retreat into the forest. Other historians say that's not true because the Mughals also had to go back and they did not pursue Maharana Pratap into Haldighat. And afterwards, the coins of Haldighat, the coins of the Haldighati area, was still Mewari currency. They still had Maharana Pratap on their coins, and the currency used was still Rajput coinage. It was not Mughal coinage. So that indicates that after the war of Haldighat, Maharana Pratap still held the land of Haldighat. So therefore, how can we say that the Mughals won the war when the Mughals made no territorial victories, nor did the Mughals accomplish what they were doing? And this was not a war where two sides met. Maharana Pratap was the defending side, and the Mughals were the invading force. So many historians say what you have to view this as is Maharana Pratap was defending, the Mughals invaded, and they pulled back because they failed to invade Mewar. So this is up to your take. I think the government and the education board has recently made a change that shows the history textbooks that Maharana Pratap won the war of Haldighat, but obviously it's a huge thing of currency. I personally think he did win just because he still held the land and it was You can call it a failed Mughal invasion rather than a strategical retreat, which resulted in Rajput defeat. But it was actually a Mughal failure of invasion because Maharana Pratap still held on to his territories, especially held on to Haldighat. But it's up to you. It's honestly, it's a controversial issue, and your take is as good as anyone else's. So after the Battle of Haldighat, as we remember, a lot of territories were lost after the siege of Chittorgarh during Uday Singh's rule. So after this, after Akbar's invasion into Haldighat, one difference between Maharana Pratap and Akbar is that Akbar would usually send his soldiers forward. And as we mentioned, many great Indian kings have this tendency and this trait that they would rule from the front, not the back. So Pratap would fight alongside his soldiers, which is why such a thing like this could even happen when Pratap sliced Belal Khan in half, because he was fighting alongside his men as well. It was typical for Rajputs to do because of their code, their honor code. So following the Battle of Haldighat, Maharana Pratap went into a guerrilla warfare. He would be attacking from the forest, from the jungles. He would be attacking the Mughals, retreating, attacking them again. And he would use these strategies to wear the Mughals down over and over. This strategy would be then used by Malakamba and eventually would be used by the Marathas as well, two entities and people that we will be talking about after Maharana Pratap. So after many years, after about a decade or so, Maharana Pratap found an opportunity, and this was a reconquest of Mewar. So he had attacked Devar, which was a Mughal post, and he seized all 36 Mughal military outposts of Mewar. And historians call this the Marathon of Mewar because all these territories that were lost after the siege of Chittor, Maharana Pratap gained everything back except for Chittorgarh fort itself. So Maharana Pratap restored the eminence of the Mewaris except for that one fort, Chittorgarh. Following the devastation of this loss, this Mughal loss at the hands of Maharana Pratap, when Maharana Pratap seized all these 36 Mughal military outposts of Mewar and retook Mewar, Akbar seized all military operations against Mewar. He stopped all invasions, he stopped all military attacks against Mewar due to this, due to Maharana Pratap's seizing of these outposts and reclaiming Mewar. Maharana Pratap later died about 15 years later in a hunting accident. And Amar Singh, which was who was Maharana Pratap's son, would also continue the fight against the Mughals. So after Maharana Pratap, the Mughals began resuming their invasions into Mewar. So Amar Singh would fight against that. Another key player that was around parallelly during the time of Maharana Pratap, was around during the same time Maharana Pratap was alive, was the Queen of Gondwana, who was Rani Durgavati. Rani Durgavati was the Queen of Gondwana, and for some context, she was instrumental in repulsing an invasion by Malwa. Malwa was ruled by Baz Bahadur. Baz Bahadur was later, I think someone has their, if you could mute yourself, so be nice. So Malwa, after Malwa was captured by Mughal invaders, Baz Bahadur of Malwa later took refuge with Uday Singh. So you can see the parallel of how all these events were happening. This led Gondwana to then border the Mughal Empire, and the Mughal Empire then set their sights on invading Gondwana. Akbar then sent his sights on taking Gondwana and taking Gondwana's riches. So the war with the Mughals was So the war with the Mughal Empire eventually happened in 1564 with Asif Khan versus Rani Durgavati. The battle happened at Narai, and it led to heavy losses on both sides. Rani Durgavati lost more men than the Mughal side did. Her Faujzar Arjun Das was killed, and that forced Rani Durgavati to lead the army herself in her war with the Mughal Empire. She had to lead the army herself against the Mughal invaders, and this was day one of war. So after the war in day one, Rani Durgavati met with her lieutenants, and she said, in order to keep in order to beat the Mughal Empire, she needed to invade at night. But her lieutenants refused. Her lieutenants refused to attack at night, and they shot down Rani Durgavati's plan. So then, when the day started again, Rani Durgavati then invaded. Rani Durgavati then invaded the Mughal Empire, not the Mughal invaders that were there. And Veer Narayan, who was Rani Durgavati's son, went on and pushed the Mughals back 3 times, despite having fewer numbers. But she was forced to retreat. So after Veer Narayan retreated, in the war, Rani Durgavati was injured, an arrow actually pierced her neck, and she was forced to fall unconscious for a while. And after she fell unconscious and she got back up, she realized that the war was lost. The Mughals were holding her location, and she killed herself in order to avoid capture. Somebody's mic is on. Like there's a lot of resound, so it's a bit hard. If you could mute yourselves, that would be.
Yeah, I'm hearing an echo.
Yeah, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I'm hearing an echo.
Yeah. Yeah. If you have a question, you can always ask. But if you're just listening, if you could please mute yourselves, that would be greatly appreciated. So that led to the death of Rani Durgavati, who was a great king of India. And that led to Gondwana being invaded by the Mughals. And now we move on to Malakamba. Malakamba was also around parallelly during this time. So all these great people were living parallelly in their fight against Mughal imperialism and Mughal dominance. Malakamba is a very fascinating story because he's not a historical figure that a lot of us know, but it's so fascinating and so interesting that we should know about him just because of what he has done and his origins and his story as a person. He was born in Ethiopia, of the Oromo people. He was not born in India. He was an African born in Ethiopia. When he was born, his birth name was Chapu. And this time in Ethiopia, during this 1500s, the slavery was rampant. So once the Turkic invasion started into India, starting from the Ghaznavids and the Ghurids, slavery became more inherent because the Islamic world, the Arab world was more connected, and it led to many slaves and a lot of trade happening in the Islamic world. So slavery was incredibly rampant in Ethiopia during this time, especially the Oromo people, the people in which Malakamba was from. They were heavily persecuted. So when he was only 12 years old, Chapu, which was his name at the time, Chapu was captured and he was sold when he was only 12 years old by Arabic invaders. He was separated from his family, and these Arabic traders captured him and sold him into slavery. You can imagine how frightening that would be for a 12-year-old child. He ended up with a man called Mir Qasim, which was, in a strange way, although he is now a slave, was one of the best things to happen to him, in the long term at least. Mir Qasim took him to Baghdad. When he went to Baghdad, he renamed Chapu as Ambar. He gave him an Arabic name. And he had Ambar convert to Islam from his religion before. They were a spiritualist Oromo people. He had Ambar convert to Islam. And one thing Mir Qasim did, which is very strange and out of the blue, not typical of most slave holders, is that he taught Ambar to read, to write, he basically educated Ambar in a way that he might not have been educated had he remained in Ethiopia. So since he ended up with Mir Qasim educated Malik Ambar. And by the time Malik was 23 years old, which is about 11 years after he was captured and sold to Mir Qasim, they went to Deccan. They went to India for business opportunities. As India was famously wealthy, Mir Qasim wanted to travel to India to set up some business because he found some good business opportunities to make himself money. He went to the Deccan. He went to the south of India when Malik was 23 years old. So this is where they ended up. From Ethiopia, they eventually made their way to Ahmednagar. Ahmednagar is where Malik Ambar would end up. You can see the Mughals that are pushing in at this time. This entire territories would very quickly be taken by the Mughal Empire in such a way that Ahmednagar is then bordering the Mughal Sultanate, the Mughal Empire. That's very important because we'll see how Malik Ambar's life develops during his time in India. Now he has found his way from Ethiopia to Iraq, and now he's found his way to India. His life in India was such that after he got here, Mir Qasim sold him off to the chief minister of the Sultan of Ahmednagar. So that tied Ambar very close to the royal family of Ahmednagar. Although he was still a slave, what Ambar realized was in India, even for slaves, social mobility was a very possible opportunity. Social mobility is the concept that America was founded upon. Was that if you come here and you work hard, regardless of your backing or regardless of your family connections, if you work hard, the way the society is structured is that you can come up in life in terms of money, in terms of societally, politically, anything. If you work hard, you can come up. That concept Amber realized was very much prevalent in the Deccan. So once he came south and he was sold off to Chengiz Khan. Chengiz Khan was named after the Chengiz Khan of the Mongol Sultanate, just to clarify that. He was trained as a warrior and he was a close aide of Chengiz Khan because Chengiz Khan realized that this slave that he had purchased was not only was he educated, but he showed a lot of promise as a prodigy. He showed a lot of capabilities as somebody who had a lot of potential within him. Chengiz Khan recognized that and began training Ambar as a warrior, as a politician, and continued his education. Unfortunately, what happened was Chengiz Khan was executed by the Sultan of Ahmednagar due to political reasons. A lot of politicians turned against Chengiz Khan because they didn't like the fact that Chengiz Khan was rising up the political ranks very quickly. So they had Chengiz Khan executed. They put some false allegations against him. They had him executed. This is obviously very tragic for Malik Ambar. But good thing was, even though such a tragedy happened, since his slave owner was executed, Malik Ambar became a free man. He became a free man and he was a mercenary for a while. He had a lot of men with him and he eventually joined hands with Chand Bibi of Bijapur. So, Chand Bibi of Bijapur. He eventually traveled to Bijapur and he joined with Chand Bibi, who he respected a lot. Chand Bibi was another queen. She was called the Sultana of Bijapur. She was another female hero of India. And Chand Bibi fought against Akbar because Akbar was also continuing his Mughal invasions. Parallelly, Akbar was also fighting Gondwana. He was also fighting Maharana Pratap. Akbar was now pushing southwards. Malik Ambar and Chand Bibi together defeated the Mughals, and Chand Bibi became the regent of Ahmednagar also. So Chand Bibi became more powerful upon defeating the Mughals, and it led to a short era of peace because the Mughals then stayed clear of the Deccan for a while, and they focused on their northern exploits, their northern pursuits. Unfortunately, Chand Bibi was assassinated after a short while of peace, and the Mughals immediately attacked Ahmednagar because since this iron-willed lady was not there, because this lady, Chand Bibi, was a powerful leader, powerful queen. Now that she was out of the picture, they fell upon Ahmednagar. The Mughals invaded and seized Ahmednagar, and Malik Ambar, upon hearing that Chand Bibi had died, Malik Ambar respected Chand Bibi a lot. She was a role model and an icon that Malik Ambar looked up to. And then he vowed that he would fight for the south. He would fight for the Deccan. He would fight for Ahmednagar against the Mughal Empire. And Malik Ambar started building an army. Malik Ambar, just as he is a personification of diversity in India at that point, Malik Ambar's army was also very diverse. He had Habshis, he had Africans, he had Persians, Arabs, Indians. Along with that, he also had Marathi Hindus. And the Marathi Hindus were a very important part of Malik Ambar's army. Because Malik Ambar, just like Maharana Pratap did for a short bit of time, he relied on the strategy of using the speed of the Marathi cavalry. Maharana Pratap obviously was in Rajputana. He didn't have access to Marathi cavalry. But Malik Ambar had that opportunity. He used Marathi cavalry, which were known for their legendary speed. The Marathi cavalry were known for hundreds of years for how fast they were. This was used in the future also by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and Peshwa Bajirao Balladar as well. So using these Marathi Hindu speed, he would attack, invade, plunder the Mughal invaders, the Mughal territories. And after a while, he eventually retook Ahmednagar, which is an incredible achievement because he forced the Mughals to leave Ahmednagar once more. So this is just a map that you can see the situation that Malik Amba was in. He was surrounded by the Bijapur Sultanate, and he was surrounded by this vast Mughal empire. Surrounded by this vast Mughal empire, and he was surrounded by the Bijapur Sultanate. You can see in Gondwana currently the territories of Rani Durgavati. So Malik Amba started defending Ahmednagar against the Mughal empire. He pushed the Mughals back. The Mughals pushed all the way in. He pushed the Mughals back, and now he was walking on an incredibly political tightrope. Because not only was he an African who would not be readily accepted into Indian politics, but he also had to balance two very powerful entities above him and below him. Bargigiri was the tactic that we just talked about. It was when the Maratha cavalry would use their legendary speed to harass the Mughal armies. The Mughal army was massive, just beyond proportions massive. They had tens, if not hundreds of thousands of men. They had lots of gunpowder, they had muskets, huge cannons, and elephants. The only thing, though, is that their incredible size made them slow. So Malik Amba used the size of the Mughals against them, just as Maharana Pratap did for a short amount of time. And he used this tactic that he called Bargigiri to attack the Mughals speedily and retreat before the Mughals could recover. These were tactics that were advanced upon, more developed, and used by the Marathas later on to establish the Maratha Empire. So what Malik Amba did was, he knew that the Indian nobility will not be happy with an African ruling over them. So he established a Sultan, Murtaza Nizam Shah, in Ahmednagar. And what Malik Amba did was, he had the Sultan marry his daughter. By marrying his daughter, this tied Malik Amba very close to the throne without actually being upon it. And the Sultan Murtaza was basically a puppet of Malik Amba. Malik Amba ran the show, but for name's sake, Murtaza was a sultan. Murtaza also had other wives. He had Malik Amba's daughter as a wife. Another one of his Persian wives, a Persian wife, told and started poisoning Sultan Murtaza's mind. Told him, this Malik Amba, he's just using you. Malik Amba is just using you. You are his puppet. People are saying you're just his puppet. Malik Amba is running the show. What are you doing? Eventually, Sultan Murtaza began turning against Malik Amba and he started alienating his wife, Malik Amba's daughter. Started alienating her and started getting closer with this Persian queen that was whispering all these things into Sultan Murtaza's head. When Malik Amba heard about this, he swiftly had Sultan Murtaza assassinated and the Persian queen also assassinated, and he put a small child on the throne, and he declared himself regent. Regent basically means, if you remember when we talked about how Bairam Khan was ruling and fighting for Akbar because Akbar was too young. Similarly, Malik Amba took up this role while he put this small child on the throne. So now there was no problems that Malik Amba would face in terms of ruling over the place, or pesky sultans and pesky nobilities and nobles trying to politically wrest for control. At this point in time, Akbar had passed away. So you can see Akbar had passed away and left behind this empire. After Akbar passed away, after Akbar's wars with Rani Durgavati, Maharana Pratap, Akbar's son, Jahangir, took over as the emperor of the Mughal Empire. And Akbar could not defeat Malik Amba. He could not fight. He could not capture Malik Amba. Eventually, when Akbar passed away and Jahangir took over, this mission went on to Jahangir of the Mughal Empire to take Ahmednagar and push further down south. But just because of the way Malik Amba would conduct his kingdom, the tactics he used, this Bargigiri tactics he would use, it became near impossible. It became near impossible, despite the Mughals being so large, to capture such a small territory because of these tactics that Malik Amba utilized. It is said that Jahangir got so upset that he could not capture Malik Amba, that he ordered for a portrait to be created. In this portrait, it was Jahangir shooting the decapitated head of Malik Amba. That's how frustrated he got with Malik Amba, that he had a photo created of Jahangir shooting Malik Amba's head. This is how Jahangir was getting frustrated. He was unable to defeat the Mughals. Eventually, though, the Mughals scored a decisive victory against the Marathas. So, not the Marathas, the Maratha cavalry that Malik Amba used. Because they figured out that the main tactic that Malik Amba would use was using the strength and the speed of the Maratha cavalry to quickly attack the Mughals. So, what the Mughals did was they set a bait. They had the army per usual, but they built deep trenches, deep holes into the ground, deep trenches. So when the cavalry attacked, they fell into those trenches and they were easy prey for the Mughals to finish off. This led to a huge defeat, and the Mughals actually pushed very much into Ahmednagar. They took a lot of Ahmednagar. This was during when Malik Ambar was even older. He was in his 60s, 70s. Malik Ambar realized that something drastic had to be done in order to save Ahmednagar from the Mughal invasions. So what Malik Ambar did was he used the Marathi cavalry raids again to slow down the Mughal Empire, and the story between Malik Ambar and Jahangir's Mughal Empire would collide at the Battle of Bhatwadi. At this battle, what Malik Ambar did was Malik Ambar chose the terrain because the Mughals are the invaders. So Malik Ambar chose a place where they were going to fight, and the Mughals had no choice but to come to him because the Mughals were the ones who wanted to invade Ahmednagar. So Malik Amba flooded the entire place. He took a higher ground, and you have this entire territory. He flooded the entire place with water, so that when it dried, it became sticky, it became disgusting, smelly, it became horrific. And during this entire time, the Mughals that had to suffer in this disgusting wasteland that Malik Amba created, they were also doing cavalry raids with the Marathi cavalry. So not only were the Mughals struggling to survive in this disgusting terrain that Malik Amba created, they couldn't even sleep or sit peacefully without knowing when the Marathi cavalry was going to attack them quickly and escape and then attack again. This psychological warfare led to so many Mughal soldiers being fed up with the Mughal Empire that a good amount of them actually defected over to Malik Amba, this invading army. Some of them started joining Malik Amba because they realized that Malik Amba was a better option for them. When Malik Ambar's army grew so that it became more powerful than the Mughal invading force, Malik Ambar invaded and crushed the Mughal invasions. This then completely halted Mughal invasions into Ahmednagar. And 2 years after the Battle of Bhatwadi, at 80 years old, Malik Ambar died. That means at this battle, in which Malik Ambar completely defeated the Mughals, he was 78 years old. He was 78 years old. That just shows just an incredible number to think about. He died 2 years after this battle, and following his death, unfortunately, Malik Ambar's son was not as capable as the father. Malik Ambar's son was not as capable as Malik Ambar was, and the Mughals invaded Ahmednagar right after Malik Ambar died. So now we're following all these freedom struggles, freedom stories against the Mughals. Now we're going to talk about the empire that rose up against the Mughal Empire and would eventually win back India its independence from foreign invaders, which is the Maratha Empire. The Maratha Empire was headed by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj from 1630 to 1680. So this is a few years following the end of Malik Ambar. So we had Akbar. We had Akbar as the person who started his imperial campaigns. He fought Rani Durgavati. He fought Maharana Pratap. Then we had Jahangir. Jahangir fought Maharana Pratap's son, Amar Singh, and Jahangir also fought Malik Ambar. Now, following Jahangir's death, the new Mughal emperor that we have, and he's not remembered well, is Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb is not remembered well because, unlike his predecessors, he reverted back to the old Islamic invasion practices. He reinstituted the tax that non-Muslims would have to pay just for their religion. He also continued his campaign of forcibly conversions. These forcible conversions, destruction of Hindu temples happened all across the board. It's not as if it didn't happen under Akbar's time. It happened under Akbar's time, happened under most of the Mughal emperor's time. Aurangzeb was even more in that direction. We had a bit of a breath of fresh air when it came to radical political ideologies, with Akbar toning it down a bit. not toning it down to the point where there was some sort of secular complete cohesion, but it was far better than the Turkic invaders before him. Aurangzeb reverted back to the very brutal ways of governing that the Turkic invaders before him had, especially when it came to religion and culture. So this was a political atmosphere in which Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj was born into. So Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj at this time was no longer a Chhatrapati, nor was he respected as a Maharaj. He was just Shivaji when he was born. Political atmosphere in which he was born, I talked about Aurangzeb with the Mughal Empire. And at this point, Ahmednagar was conquered. Ahmednagar was conquered by the Mughals, and Bijapur was a sultanate that was left. Adil Shahi, the Adil Shahi Sultanate that was ruled by Adil Shah. Adil Shah ruled the Adil Shahi Sultanate of Bijapur. This was a political atmosphere in which he was born. Shivaji's father was not some powerful king. He was a small lord that would be switching his loyalty back and forth between the Mughals and the Adil Shahi Sultanate, whichever was best for them to survive. Chhatrapati Shivaji was very much devoted to his mother. He would study the Mahabharata and Ramayana very early on, and he would study a lot of Hindu scriptures. He sought the company of Hindu saints very often, Hindu rishis, enlightened beings, self-realized souls. At 15 years old, just 15 years old, in a letter he expressed his concept of Hindavi Swaraj. Swaraj was this concept that would eventually carry India through this period of turmoil and this tumultuous time. Hindavi Swaraj translates into Indian self-rule. So the Mughals were a Turkic dynasty. As much as some historians like to say that the Mughals were the Mughals are good, they coexisted with India. At the end of the day, the inalienable fact is the Mughals were a Turkic dynasty. Regardless of how much they assimilated, it was still a foreign power that was ruling us as a people. So Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj expressed his concept of Hindavi Swaraj at just 15 years old, which basically said Indian self-rule. He wanted India to be ruled by Indians. This was a sort of concept that's also you see in the American colonies when they want to break away from the British. That concept of wishing for self-rule. Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj came up with that 100 years before the quest for American revolution. But it draws a parallel in order for you to kind of get a grasp of what it means. So imagine a 15-year-old boy without much land to his name. All he has is a bit of land. That too is granted only by the Adil Shahi Sultanate of Bijapur and the Mughal Empire. A 15-year-old boy has come up with this idea to completely eradicate these foreign invaders from India. This type of vision, this type of inhumane level of fortitude and greatness is the reason why a lot of people today, a lot of Indians today not only remember Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, but we worship him for what he has done, for the incredible pivotal moments that he brought out that changed the entire future of India. And as on Independence Day, we should remember that the way we are today, the language we speak, the way we are, the way we act, us as a people are only alive today. You and me are only alive today the way we are because of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Had it not been for this man, none of us today would be the way we are, as in we would have been different, either religiously, culturally, maybe even ethnically. We would have been a different people altogether. He was noted by every source, by Mughal sources, Portuguese sources, Marathi sources, Hindu sources, Islamic sources, as an incredible administrator, and he had an incredible strong system of ethics, values, and morals and principles that he refused to deviate from, which came from his religious youth, from being devoted to his mother, studying Hindu scriptures, wanting to be with Hindu saints. All these things shaped him as a person. So this is the map I found to show what Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj was born into. Shivaji was born into this. This entire territory was ruled by the Mughals. This entire territory was ruled by the Bijapur Sultanate. This is what Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's father ruled. Ruling this, can you imagine anybody who would say, I want to rid India of these two juggernauts? The Mughals were some of the most powerful empires, forget in India, in the entire world at that time. So at 15 years old, after creating his concept of Indian self-rule, of Hindavi Swaraj, After creating this concept of Swaraj, he began his mission to free India from these foreign invaders. He first bribed Inayat Khan to hand over a Bijapur fort. So if you remember, Bijapur is down here, the Mughal Empire is up here. And he did this a lot in his early stages. He used money. He would bribe both Bijapur and Mughal lords to give up their forts. So he began collecting forts because he understood, especially in this time period, the importance of forts to hold on to an empire is very important. And using the same strategies, and he advanced upon these strategies by using the legendary speed of the Marathi cavalry. He would raid and he began seizing territories. And at one point, the Mughals and the Bijapur Sultanate had Shivaji's father arrested in order to stop Shivaji from these seizing and the raidings. That's how threatened they felt by a 15-year-old boy. So eventually, after Shivaji became calm and he began consolidating his gains, after they released his father, he simply continued his mission. And he started this organized movement for self-rule. He started uniting the Maratha people, uniting the Hindus, uniting even Muslims. There were a lot of Muslims. 30% of Shivaji's army were Muslims. So basically, the concept he was not just an icon for like Hindu people or a certain religion. He is an icon for Indians, regardless of your caste, your religion, because of the concept he had was not for Hindu self-rule. His concept was for Indian self-rule. So his conflicts obviously arose with the neighboring Mughal Empire and the Adil Shahi Sultanate. When I say Adil Shahi Sultanate, that term means the same thing as the Bijapur Sultanate, just to keep in mind. Then they are located down here. And the reason I use this map, I had to find a separate map that showed the holdings of Shivaji's father. Because if you go on any other map that shows the other empires, you don't even find the territories that Shivaji was born into was so small and insignificant, they are not even shown on this map. But yeah, you can see how incredibly small they were. And Shivaji began slowly expanding that. Afzal Khan was the Bijapur Sultanate, the Adil Shahi, took notice that this Shivaji is starting to get more powerful than we would like for a Indian ruler to get. So their first move was to send Afzal Khan. So before this, the reason the Bijapur Sultanate started taking him more seriously was, even though he was not born into some great empire or some great kingdom, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj had captured 40 forts by 1657. By the time he was 27 years old, he had captured 40 forts, either by bribery, either by raiding, by capturing. He used all sorts of techniques to build his fledgling kingdom. In order to stop him, Bijapur sent Afzal Khan with 10,000 troops, with a huge army, in order to defeat Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. And as per usual with these Turkic invaders and these Turkic kingdoms, before attacking Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, the Bijapuri forces desecrated the Tulja Bhavani temple, which is a temple that is very holy and important for Shivaji's family, and another temple, the Vithoba temple. So Shivaji, once he heard about Afzal Khan, he outmaneuvered Afzal Khan and he took refuge in Pratapgarh fort. And Afzal Khan, upon hearing that Shivaji is in Pratapgarh fort, he sieged Pratapgarh fort and he was unable to break through the fort. This continued for 2 months until Afzal Khan requested a parley in order for there to be a meeting in which Afzal Khan and Shivaji would meet and they would come to some sort of agreement. Shivaji accepted. What happened though is Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and Afzal Khan met at the foothills of Pratapgarh, the foothills of the fort that Shivaji was occupying at that time. So Shivaji expected Afzal Khan to treacherously attack him because Afzal Khan was known for that. He was known for being a very traitorous type of person. Regardless, Shivaji expected Afzal Khan to do some sort of treachery. So what Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj did was he wore armor underneath his clothes. He concealed a bagnak, which was a tiger claw. It's a type of weapon in which you would hold, and there are these piercers. It's like a claw, essentially. It resembles a claw of animals. They're called tiger claw. And he concealed a dagger as well. And one thing to remember is imagine the bravery and the courage Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj had to have had, because Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj was not powerfully big or built. We mentioned how Maharana Pratap was 7 foot, more than 7 feet tall, 7 feet 5 inches. Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj was only 5'6". He was only 5'6", and Afzal Khan was 7 foot tall. So he had to be very careful. He had to be meticulous in what he would do right now. So Afzal Khan tried to kill Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj as Shivaji expected. But Afzal Khan, while hugging Shivaji, he took his dagger and tried to stab Shivaji in the back. But Shivaji, since Shivaji wore the armor underneath his clothes, the dagger was stopped by the armor. And using the tiger claws, Shivaji dug it into Afzal Khan's chest and disemboweled him. And he killed Afzal Khan. And then after that, Shivaji gave he had a cannon fired, which was a signal for hidden Maratha troops around the camp to attack. This was one of the most humiliating defeats for the Bijapur Sultanate, because despite sending such a huge army, not only did Shivaji single-handedly kill Afzal Khan, but Shivaji's smaller number of forces completely eradicated Afzal Khan. There is also another instance in which Maratha troops, using certain tactics, had only a couple thousand men, defeated 30,000 Uzbekistani invading forces. Uzbekistan, that caused the territories ruled by Uzbekistan to stop sending attacks. It's still, I think it's written as a world record for one of the most incredible victories. Just with a couple thousand Maratha soldiers, completely eradicated 30,000 Uzbek invaders. So that's another event that happened, not related to Shivaji's battle with Afzal Khan. So Pratapgarh was a decisive victory for the Marathas. They seized hundreds of thousands of huns, or huns is a currency. They seized a lot of money. They went and sacked a fort. So not only did Afzal Khan fail in his invasion, he lost a fort as well. So after these conflicts with the Bijapur Sultanate, Aurangzeb also started noticing Shivaji's rise, and Shivaji started having conflicts with the Mughals as well. Because in order to establish Indian self-rule, the Mughals have to go. There's no other doubt about it, because the Mughals are the largest Turkic kingdom sitting on top of India. So Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj started raiding Ahmednagar, Junnar, and many other places that were ruled by the Mughals. This led Aurangzeb to send Shaista Khan with 150,000 soldiers. 150,000 soldiers, because after the Bijapur Sultan failed so miserably, Aurangzeb was not taking any chances. He sent 150,000 soldiers, and these Shaista Khan managed to seize Pune and Chakan. So he seized Pune. So what Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj did was, he created a fake, whether it was fake or it is real is not mentioned, but there was a wedding ceremony. So there was all the people going on with a huge wedding procession happening. In the wedding procession, Shivaji, disguised with his men, entered the wedding procession through Pune, and they broke away from the wedding procession, and they attacked Shaista Khan, who was sitting in the Lal Mahal, which was Shivaji's residence. So they attacked Shaista Khan, and in the fighting, Shaista Khan lost a finger. Some people say he lost 3 fingers, and he escaped back to Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb was so disappointed and was so upset with Shaista Khan that despite sending Shaista Khan with 150,000 soldiers, he managed to get defeated by Shivaji. And Shaista Khan was then transferred to Bengal. His duties then transferred over to Bengal. Afterwards, Aurangzeb then sent Mirza Raja Jai Singh with another massive army to attack Shivaji. This time, Shivaji was forced to sign what was called the Treaty of Purandar, which was it was not a good treaty for the Marathas. Out of the 40 forts that Shivaji had, 23 forts had to be given up to the Mughals, 400,000 Huns had to be paid to the Mughals, and Shivaji's son Sambhaji was to serve the Mughals. And then after this, Aurangzeb insisted that Shivaji should come to Agra. Now, this is an instance that is an entire PowerPoint discussion of its own. It's asked, why did Shivaji go to Agra? Because Shivaji predicted that when he would go to Agra, Aurangzeb would do some sort of treacherous, something treacherous he would do. And which happened. After Shivaji went to Agra, Aurangzeb treated him very badly and asked Shivaji to stand behind ordinary captains of an army, despite Shivaji being a man of such high repute. Since Aurangzeb was trying to insult him by asking him to sign behind his captains, Shivaji got upset and he stormed out of the court of Agra. And Aurangzeb had Shivaji placed under house arrest, had Shivaji arrested in Agra inside Shivaji's room. So this was not a good situation for Shivaji. It said Shivaji went to Aurangzeb's capital of Agra because firstly he had so much self-confidence in himself that he knew even if something happens, even if they capture me or anything, he had the confidence that he'll be able to solve it and get out of it. That's the self-confidence he had. On top of that, he also wanted to see how Agra was run. He wanted to see the bureaucratic processes. He wanted to see the administrative processes. He wanted to see how the economy was running. He wanted to see how the army was being formatted, how they're being trained, utilized. He wanted to see how the Mughals were running their empire, this enterprise of empire. So he could take notes and see if he could implement any of that for his own kingdom. That is another reason he went to Agra. And Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's house arrest, and more particularly, how he escaped this house arrest, is still one of the most incredible moments in Shivaji's life, anyone's life for that matter. Because imagine you're stuck in one of the greatest empires of the time. You're not even in some dungeon. You are living in the residence where Aurangzeb wants you. So what happened was Aurangzeb's court then started arguing on what to do with Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Because Shivaji was not some ordinary person you can kill. This Indian self-rule, this Swaraj movement had taken root. So there was many debates like whether should we kill Shivaji, should we arrest Shivaji, what should we do with Shivaji? In order to keep this system slow, what Shivaji would do was he regularly bribed Aurangzeb's courtiers. So these courtiers would argue why Shivaji should not be killed. So this argument would keep on going. Whenever the argument started turning in favor of killing Shivaji, Shivaji would start bribing certain courtiers. And these courtiers would start arguing with intensity to, we shouldn't kill Shivaji. So using this tactic, Shivaji extended his life for a long, long time. Because Aurangzeb could not just kill Shivaji due to the personality that Shivaji was. So after a while, Shivaji, what he started to do was he feigned illness. He faked being super sick, that I can't see anyone, I am incredibly ill. And in order so that people would pray for his well-being, he started sending gifts out to people, to Hindu rishis, Hindu saints, fakirs, to the normal people. He started sending these gifts out to people. And then as per like security works today in the airports, like that, Aurangzeb's soldiers would be checking whenever Shivaji would send any gifts out. They would be checking to make sure there's only gifts there, nothing else, no letters, anything vulnerable that could hurt the Mughal Empire like that. So Shivaji did this for months, many months, for sending out these gifts. And eventually at a certain point, the Mughal soldiers just became like, it's just Shivaji, he's sending his gifts per day, usual thing. It became a usual thing, Shivaji sending gifts. So once that became a usual thing, Shivaji used that as an opportunity to hide Sambhaji and Shivaji in one of these boxes, in one of these huge containers that they would send gifts out. He himself hid in it. And he had his men take him out. And the Mughal soldiers that were supposed to do their job did not do their job, because this was not like a short period of time. This was many, many, many months that Shivaji was held by Aurangzeb, held by the Mughal Empire. So using this tactic, Shivaji escaped the Mughal Empire. Afterwards, Aurangzeb was obviously furious. He ordered for an investigation into how Shivaji escaped, but the investigation brought out nothing. This is the typical version that is written about in Maratha texts. Following this, Shivaji brokered a small period of peace with the Mughals, and a small period of peace ensued. But obviously, Chhatrapati Shivaji is not there just to self-preserve his territories. He continued his quest for Swaraj, for self-rule, and he continued his raids and conquests. And all these forts that we mentioned, he lost. He lost his 23 forts and all these things. He recovered most of the territories that he lost from the Mughals in just a matter of 4 months. And there was a battle of Vani Dindori in which the Mughals tried to stop Shivaji. Once they realized Shivaji had continued his usual work and usual business. And in that battle, Shivaji completely eradicated the Mughal invaders. So it allowed Shivaji to even more boastfully continue his invasions. So why the reason we remember Chhatrapati Shivaji is not just because once being a single person, he built an entire movement, an entire concept, and eventually an entire empire single-handedly, but it is also because of his values and his strict moral code in which he refused to budge from. So I'll just mention a few of the main ones that are many people are aware of. One thing was tolerance, as typically we saw Hindu Indian rulers were. They were pretty much very tolerant. Even Maharana Pratap Sami, there were many Muslim generals, and his own top senior general of Maharana Pratap was Hakim Khan Sur, who was an Afghan. He was not even an Indian, he was an Afghan. So, uh, one quote that he had was, "Verily, Islam and Hinduism are terms of contrast. They're used by the true divine painter for blending the colors and filling in the outlines. If it's a mosque, the call to prayer is chanted in remembrance of him. If it is a temple, the bells are rung in yearning for him alone." So we can see how Shivaji held Hinduism and Islam not as one superior to the other, but he had a very secular view, and he viewed them as one and the same, just different ways of approaching God. And 30% of Chhatrapati Shivaji's army was said to be made up of Muslims. Today, the Muslim population of India is 15%. So 30% of the entire army of Chhatrapati Shivaji, including his own bodyguards, not just normal foot soldiers, generals and bodyguards, even Muslims even made up those roles. So it furthers the idea and the argument that Shivaji is not just a Hindu icon, but he is an Indian icon. And another thing was he had one of his main values was a respect for women, which was brought upon by his upbringing, his attachment to his mother, and so on. Even on captured territories, which was something that was very unheard of in the time, especially by the Turkic invaders that would come in and would regularly commit all sorts of crimes against the civilians and the women that they would capture. Shivaji insisted that women were to be respected in captured territories. The women were they were allowed to leave. They were allowed to leave unharmed. That was, he was very particular about that. And especially for crimes against women, he had very, very harsh punishments in his kingdom. And he's also known as the father of the Indian Navy because he built a Maratha Navy in a geography, a piece of geography in India, where it was all about land based war. The Mughals, the Bijapur Sultanate, a majority of their army was on land. They did not invest at all in their navy, very small investments. Shivaji understood the importance of the navy as times were advancing, which is one of the reasons why the British, the French would have so much success in terms of conquering the entire world. It's because of their investment into the navy. So Chhatrapati Shivaji obviously had this understanding, and he started building the Maratha Navy, and he had many naval bases along the coast of present-day Maharashtra. And there's much, much more for which we remember Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj today. So Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj also led many conquests in southern India. And he continued consolidating the Maratha Empire throughout his life. He invaded Karnataka, and he expanded in the south as well, just as much as fighting his enemies in the north, such as the Mughal Empire and such. He eventually died from dysentery at 50 years old, but he left behind an unprecedented legacy because he laid the foundations for the Hindavi Swaraj, which would be continued on. Following the death of Shivaji, there would be a few more kings in which we would see another great personality come up, Bajirao Peshwa Bajirao, which we will talk about in a bit. So just so we can get a bit of an understanding for how incredible Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's accomplishments were, we can just look at this right here. In 1646, when Shivaji was only 16 years old, by then he had 4 forts and he had 2,000 soldiers. By the time he died at 50 years old, his 4 forts became 300 forts, and 2,000 soldiers became 100,000 soldiers. So he built an entire kingdom, entire empire from scratch. And you can see how the Bijapur Sultanate eventually fell apart. And you can see how, from not even being on the map, Chhatrapati Shivaji carved out this entire empire. So a few years following Chhatrapati Shivaji's, 220 years following Chhatrapati Shivaji's death, Peshwa Bajirao Balal was born. So the Maratha emperors were Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, then his son Sambhaji, then Rajaram, then Shahu. During Shahu's time, Chhatrapati Shahu's time, is when Peshwa Bajirao was the Peshwa. So Peshwa Bajirao was in office from 1720 to 1740. So how kings is like the king will be coronated. The Peshwa was not a royal. It was not a royal. It was not a royal position. It was a position like Peshwa is more closely associated as a prime minister role. They would be appointed by the king. And as time grew on, the Peshwas actually became more powerful than the kings themselves. They started taking up more prominent role in Maratha politics. But that would happen as time would go on more and more. The person that made the Peshwas have more influence and more dominance is Peshwa Bajirao Balal. And he is one of the greatest expansionists of the Maratha Empire because he is the one who took the Maratha Empire from the kingdom that Chhatrapati Shivaji created, and eventually he built it up to the huge Maratha Empire that we would remember today. So he only took office as Peshwa. Peshwa is a very high role. It's an incredibly high role in the Maratha government, and that led to a lot of political tensions with senior officials. Senior officials that were not happy that this young 20-year-old kid is just coming and taking the show. But Peshwa Bajirao was not just a person that was just given this position on his lap. He truly deserved the position. He was only 12 years old when he first went out to the battlefield. And at the zenith of the Maratha Empire, he fought over 35 enemies. In his 20-year-long military career as Peshwa, he fought over 35 different kingdoms and enemies. He fought over 41 battles. And in all these enemies and battles, he did not lose a single time. He was undefeated his entire career. He never knew defeat, just like Krishna Devaraya and Samudragupta and a few others in Indian history. Peshwa Bajirao campaigned against almost everyone in India. He fought against Nizam, he fought against Malwa, Gujarat, the Siddhis. He even marched into Delhi itself. By this time, especially during Peshwa Bajirao's campaigns, the Mughal Empire became a very insignificant kingdom in India. If you look at India and look for the dominant force, it is now the Marathas. The era of the Mughals is done. Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's goal of Indian self-rule is coming into fruition 20 years after his death, 20, 30, 40 years after his death, as Peshwa Bajirao is campaigning against the kingdoms around him. And Peshwa Bajirao's military strategy is globally renowned. Today we just remember Peshwa Bajirao from that Bajirao Mastani movie. But that is a very insignificant part of Peshwa Bajirao's life. An undefeated military general, incredible statistics. He was aware very much of the military strategies, a strategist beyond measure. Globally renowned today by Western, Arabic, all sorts of authors, all sorts of intellectuals renowned, have great respect for Peshwa Bajirao's campaigns, Peshwa Bajirao's military strategies. And here are a few quotes that people have of Peshwa Bajirao that will give us a bit of an idea of the greatness of him as a leader. So the campaign gives a classic example of what the predatory horse, when led by a genius, could achieve in the age of light artillery. So this was the 1700s. Guns were already a huge part of warfare. But Peshwa Bajirao's ingenious military tactics allowed for him to be one of the best cavalry generals ever known in the history of this world, despite being in the era of guns. He revolutionized the Maratha cavalry in the time of guns. That is an incredible achievement for the Marathas and for India itself. And the cavalry and the Maratha military is seen as in its best during this century, the 18th century, when Peshwa Bajirao was the main leader of the Maratha army. And he gave an example of when Peshwa Bajirao outgeneraled the Nizam ul Mulk when he fought against the Nizam as a masterpiece of strategic mobility. And he's called as the most outstanding statesman and general that India produced in the 18th century. If the only thing we can say bad about Peshwa Bajirao was that he died too early. If he had lived a bit longer, he perhaps could have fought and protected the Maratha Empire against the Afghans and the British that would eventually pop up. But he created an incredible Maratha Empire. So if Shivaji was the founder of the Maratha state, Bajirao could claim that he was the one who saved it from disruption and transformed what was a national state in an empire. So what we have to remember is we remember how Chhatrapati Shivaji forged an entire empire that spread all across the south. So this empire spread all across the south, but after Shivaji, when we had Sambhaji and Rajaram and eventually Shahu, they lost a lot of territories because the Mughal Empire got more aggressive. This is the empire that Peshwa Bajirao was born into. This is the empire that he left behind. So just take a moment to see the sheer magnitude of what he accomplished. He took this empire, which was on the back foot after many generations after Chhatrapati Shivaji's forcing, because the kings that came after Chhatrapati Shivaji were not as great as Chhatrapati Shivaji. They were good enough to maintain Maratha sovereignty though, but that was pretty much it. He turned that empire, this kingdom, into this massive empire. And the Mughals went from this powerful force to an insignificant force in the north that had to fall under the whims. They became a tributary state of the Marathas. The Mughals had to pay the Marathas in order to survive. And even the Rajput states were under the Marathas as well. So that is all we have for the end of these 3 weeks of in terms of a historical chronological setting. So just a bit of a summary of what happens afterwards. Following Peshwa Bajirao, we eventually have wars with the Afghans. And then following the wars with the Afghans, the Maratha Empire is weakened a bit, but the Marathas then began rebuilding their empire. In this process of rebuilding is when the British pop up. And then there are many series of wars between the Marathas and the British, and the rest is modern history, which we all remember. So that is the end of what we have. Let me see if I can stop share. So if there's any questions, you can always, sorry, 1 second.
Jai Shimran Chinmay, it's a great session.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you for putting all this together. Very interesting.
Can you please share the recording? We missed last week's session and part of today's session. So can you please share the recording with us?
The recordings will be shared at the end of the complete session, Sunday. Okay. You have to attend all the sessions and after that.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we will do. Thank you.
Is that when the material will be shared as well?
The material will be part of the sessions, right? The recording sessions, you should be able to see the screen presentation and everything.
Okay. Thank you.
Where will you? Do you know where will you send the recordings?
To the registered. When you registered, you have your email, right, in the form. So to all those registrants, it will be you'll be receiving it.
Oh.
Yes, I guess we can.
Namaste. Chinmay, is there any reference material you can pass on? Like where you got like which books or something like that? At the end of the...
Yeah, a few of the sources, I can put it together. A few of the sources come from online encyclopedias such as Britannica and a few others. Some come from modern Indologists and Indian researchers that went in to clear up some colonial narratives. And a few others come from a mixture of both Indian and Persian and Arabic sources, especially in the Islamic periods. And the certain books are also used, such as Jawaharlal Nehru's book, Discovery of India, although it was fact-checked because that book was written just post-colonial era. So a lot of the theories are still, a lot of the history in that book is very much British dominated, and it was altered by the British. So yeah, I can share some of the sources for sure though.
Thank you very much, Chinmay. Bless you.
And then I'll just go through the questions from the beginning. So I have a question: was Akbar forced to be king at a young age because his dad died? Yes, Humayun died unexpectedly, so Akbar was forced to become king. I think it was either Babur, I believe it was Humayun, who fell down the stairs and I believe broke his neck. In an accident, he died, which forced Akbar to become king at a young age, which is why Bairam Khan became the regent for Akbar. And then, yeah, Belol Khan was cut in half by Maharana Pratap. And not only Belol Khan, the intensity of the swing also cut Belol Khan's horse in half. Okay, another queen. We're getting close to time, only about 500 years left. Yeah, there are many Indian queens as well. If we had had more time, we could have gone to the colonial era as well. Even then, there were many incredible Indian queens and Indian women that fought for independence, such as Abaka Chota, who fought the Portuguese, and Jhansi Ki Rani, who fought the British. And there are many, many others. Mughal Empire ruled so much. How is that possible? He rules almost half of India. How do the Mughals rule so much? Yeah, the Mughals did rule a lot, but there were other empires that ruled more. You have the Mauryans and I believe the British Raj also might have ruled a bit more, although I'm not sure about the British Raj part. Yeah, there were many empires in India that would rule a lot. The Mughal Empire ruled particularly for the reason was because they revolutionized gunpowder in their way of warfare. They used gunpowder more frequently, and eventually the rest of India adapted to it as well. The Marathas quickly adapted to it, and when they merged their already indigenous cavalry speed with gunpowder and modern technology, they were able to beat the Mughals. So it was just a slight technological difference, which was eventually closed by the indigenous kingdoms as well. And obviously there were certain kings. There were many kings that came afterwards Aurangzeb that were not powerful, and they fell prey to the Maratha expansion. It depends a lot on the qualities and the capabilities of the king, because in monarchies, a lot of it depends power on the top. In a democracy, there's a bit of a shared thing when you have a bunch of ministers or MLAs or MPs or governors or representatives. You have the president. You have many people sharing responsibility. But in absolute monarchies, which was the main system of government, it really depends who you have on the top. If you have someone such as Chhatrapati Shivaji on the top, then it's an incredible result. For your kingdom, you'll see incredible results. If you have someone incapable at the top, such as maybe Muhammad bin Tughlaq, then it will be very disastrous for your kingdom. So there's many extremes. That's why we see Akbar that grew a lot and other kingdoms that did not. Who is ruling Gondwana? Rani Durgavati ruled Gondwana, and then she died fighting against Akbar.
Thank you, Nana. But next week we have to make sure we need to complete the session by 12:45 the max. Okay?
Yes, Auntie, sounds good.
Because 1 o'clock we have another meeting.
Yeah, and then the Mughals, where did they get the gunpowder? The Mughals got their gunpowder, particularly it's debated whether from the Ottomans or the Safavids, which were empires found in the Middle East and the Arab world. And gunpowder eventually, it's believed that gunpowder first started in China, and it was used as rockets and stuff. But then as gunpowder came in India, we also did our own innovations with it. We advanced upon it. In Mysore, they created rockets with gunpowders, which even the British did not see. And like Tipu Sultan used rockets. He revolutionized rockets using gunpowder to fight against the British. So, but they first came to India through the Ottomans from the Mughals, and they spread on. There are so many sultanates and Hyderabad's, Nizam, etc. Are they related to the Mughals? So typically what happened is a lot of it can be traced back to when Muhammad bin Tughlaq wanted to move his capital from Delhi to Dawlatabad in the south. But when that failed, he moved back. But a lot of the people that he forced to move from Delhi to the south remained in the south. So that caused a lot of people to set up their small independent kingdoms. And as the Mughals came, as the Delhi Sultanate fell apart, a lot of what happened was we saw a Muslim elite a Muslim nobility ruling over a majority Hindu population until the Marathas came and took back control. Are they related to the Mughals? I don't think they were. They were not. Because a lot of them came during the Delhi Sultanat's time. And the Delhi Sultanate was then replaced by the Mughal Empire. And then obviously there would have been a lot of immigration and migration. But inherently in the beginning, no. As we went on, I would expect yes, but I'm not 100% sure. Where is Gondwana today and who is ruling? I think it makes up a few states in the north today. I'm not exactly sure where. What did you consider your favorite / the most interesting king / empire period of this vast history, and why? Well, in terms of period, the Mauryan Empire obviously comes to mind just because of Chanakya's initial concept of Akhand Bharat, which would reverberate through the ages. And then in the medieval times, obviously, my favorite would be the Maratha Empire. And my two favorite figures in that period would be Chhatrapati Shivaji and Peshwa Bajirao, just for the extent of their kingdoms, and Krishna Deva Raya as well. Maharana Pratap's story was what first got me into Indian history, so that also holds a close place in my heart. But I think that's the last question.
All right, everybody, have a great day. Thank you, Chinmay.
Thank you, everyone. Jai Shri
Wonderful
Bhagwan.
session. Jai Shri Narayana.
Thank you.
Jai Shri Man, very good man. Thank you.
Thank you, Chinmay. Jai Shri Narayana.
Thank you,
Thank
Chinmay.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chinmay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.